Saint Cyprian can walk like Mercury. He can call down the angels from heaven. He can call up the demons from hell, and he can call present the spirits of the dead.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are so excited to discuss the magic of Saint Cyprian with practicing magician, author, and strategic sorcerer, Jason Miller. Jason has devoted more than 30 years to studying practical magic in its many forms, and he's the author of several tomes of magical insight, including protection and reversal magic, financial sorcery, and so many others. I definitely encourage listeners, if you haven't already, to check out the first few episodes where Jason stopped by the podcast to talk about the elements of magic and spellcrafting, as well as Hecate. Those are episodes number 20 and 34. In this episode, however, Jason returns to the podcast to talk about an intensive magical course known as the Black School, the Sorcery of Cyprian. Jason shares about the magical tradition of Saint Cyprian, how to work with this powerful current of magic. Jason also answers your wonderful Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions, so thanks to each and every patron. And Jason also shares about practical magical tips and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back Jason Miller. Jason Miller, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me. Wow, what an intro that was. I saw some of the questions that came through, so I'm really excited to be here because super solid.
I think I joined the listeners and Glitch Bottle patrons in being very thankful for your time and sharing about Cyprian in a very in-depth way. And when it comes to Cyprian, I was actually thinking of starting with a quote that you have. You say, quote, "There is a persistent legend of a black school of sorcery that has spread from as far south as France and Portugal to as far north as Iceland and Norway. This school has the reputation of being overseen by the devil himself, but other legends tell that it is the secret school that teaches the wisdom of Saint Cyprian, the sorcerer saint," unquote. So who is Saint Cyprian, especially as Saint Cyprian relates to your practice? What would you like the listeners to know?
Well, you guys can look up Saint Cyprian of Antioch and Saint Justina all on your own. So a hieromartyr who suffered martyrdom in Nicomedia back in, I think, 304 is the date of his death. But his story is that he was a sorcerer. He was the Merlin of the Mediterranean, if you will. He just knew it all. He was the greatest wizard of the age. And so, depending upon the story, he either falls in love with this maiden Justina, who was a Christian, or he was hired by someone who fell in love with Justina. But either way, he goes and sends spirits out to make her fall in love. And she senses them. She dispels them with the sign of the cross. And Saint Cyprian is like, that didn't work. Let's bring out the big guns. Let's go after her again tonight with some more. And again, dispelled with the sign of the cross. Then finally, the third night, bam, he seeks Lucifer's counsel. It is funny because the Orthodox texts tell you all the pagan gods and so on that he trained under, but then say, and of course he was in league with Lucifer. He goes on and just sends them out, and again, turned back by Justina. So what do you do when you're a sorcerer and you're getting beat? You're like, well, okay, I got to study how this person is beating me, right? So he goes and takes up Christianity, and whether he converts because he is so moved by the religion which is what, of course, the Orthodox story is, or if he decides to convert in order to seek power, we'll never really know. But he does become a bishop, and he and Justina sort of become a pair, if you will, like Helen and Simon almost. And so they become this pair close throughout their lives, not lovers. And then he allegedly threw all of his magical books out the window or burned them or something like that. And then he was martyred on September 26th, 304. Now, that's all the basic story. But the cool thing is there are people who had said, well, wait a minute, whoa. He's still a sorcerer. Like most grimoires are Christian, at least operatively. Like those are the powers that they call upon. So you have these Cyprianus texts, these grimoires appearing in his name. Like I said, in that quote, from Norway all the way down to Portugal and then spreading to Brazil and Central America. He's just everywhere. He's just everywhere, except the English-speaking world until, I don't know, like 10 years ago, when his popularity started to gain a foothold and the English-speaking world sort of woke up to Saint Cyprian. And so whether he renounced it and then in death was sort of like, actually, there's some synthesis here between angels and demons, or there's a way to work with both, or if he always was working with both in life. These are different approaches that people take. But yeah, that is Saint Cyprian. He's a powerful intercessor. In Europe, it is mostly the books that are attributed to him that are well known. And of course, he even gets invoked in grimoires as a power to conjure demons by. And then in the New World, especially, you start to see him invoked as a saint. So he has a place in Quimbanda. He has a place in San Pedro Shaman. They in particular fascinated me because I first became aware of Saint Cyprian when a friend of mine went to Peru and brought me back a medicine bottle amulet. You know, these are amulets that they literally make in like vaccine vials. And it had a soapstone Saint Cyprian. And he's like, I chose this because he's the sorcerer saint. And so that was where I started my research. And you see these mesas, these altars on the ground that the shaman have, where there's the right side with all the healing and the saints, and the left side where they have the demons and some of the, you know, more nefarious work, and Saint Cyprian right there in the middle, just dividing up the two halves of the mesa. It is in that vein, you know, I just started to pray fervently to Saint Cyprian. And eventually I wrote a prayer. It's public. People can look it up. The Sorcerer's Call to Saint Cyprian. And so that call then spread really widely. And it was sort of like after I put that call out there, I first called it a prayer. I'm like, you know, the Sorcerer's Prayer to Saint Cyprian. And Saint Cyprian said, no, make it a call. And I didn't realize that it was a call. It was a call to a lot of people because that prayer spread like wildfire amongst the Cyprian community. And then it was a call to eventually do this Black School program, which is a two-handed approach to conjuration, the magic and mystery inherent in both Christianity and diabolism.
The genesis for the Black School was undergirded by this call that you were receiving instructions from Cyprian to do. And because of the nature of the prayer and the call, it sounds like it really, really took off and caused a lot of ripples where people resonated with it. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, it did. It absolutely did. Like I said, just, you know, people out there, you can Google the Call of Saint Cyprian. It was posted by me on December 26, 2013. Although I think maybe there was even an earlier one that I posted. But that triggered a bunch of teachings, if you will, on how to work with demons. And then that itself triggered some conversations with Conjureman Ali, who I haven't heard from forever, but he shared with me a method of baptizing demons. And then I showed this to another friend of mine who is a curandero, and he was like, oh, yeah, I have that too. So I got to see two versions of the same ritual. Very, very similar, just, like differences in how many times you would repeat the Apostles' Creed and stuff like that. But yeah, there was so much happening all at the same time. And roughly at the same time period, Urs was starting to get Jose Lecho's Sorcerer's Treasure published. So the first translation of one of the Cyprian grimoires into English that have been around forever. And I had always all these pamphlets in Spanish and whatnot, but this was an extensive one in English that now has been followed by an even more extensive book. And then Umberto Meggi's version of the translation of the same text. And it's, as you know, it's always useful to have multiple people approaching the same text because they approach it from slightly different angles. And both of them have a great take on it and they're fully complementary. And yeah, there was just so much going on at that time. It was a Cyprian Renaissance.
As you mentioned, there are so many facets that you were integrating and approaching. And I think this next question really gets into that. We have a question from a Glitch Bottle patron, Manuel SC. And Manuel SC is asking, hi, Jason, what would you say your Cyprian course offers? What, for example, your Hecate course does not, besides the Christian flavor? How similar are these systems and what are the main differences?
It's not even apples and oranges. It's like apples and potatoes. They're very, very different. The Sorcery of Hecate course, it draws on a lot of methods that you can find in Vajrayana Buddhism. It's not a Hecate Tantra per se, but there are mantras, there is a mandala, there's a lot of visualizations and things like this in the Hecate course. The Saint Cyprian course is not anything like that. It's funny because anytime I've tried to say, okay, God or spirit, what is your form? What is your mantra? I've always been like, no, that's not how we roll. Like, this is different. So the Saint Cyprian course is different from the get-go. It is not at all geared toward, there's no mantra, there's no daily practice commitment, although there are suggested daily practices. But there is a lot more working with spirits. So you'll be working with demons and angels and the dead with Saint Cyprian as the intercessor a lot more. And you'll be working in different modes too. So instead of just, there's always this debate in like the grimoire community or the conjuration or the evocation community. I don't know what you want to call it. Solomonic community, maybe. Where some people are like, no, the spirits must be constrained. They must be, forced to appear until they appear fully, the full Monty, you have to feel their nuts in your hand or they're going to get one over on you. And the only way to do that is to just stand there for 3 hours and make them do it. And then you've got the other people that are just like, well, no, that's imperialistic thinking, man. You kind of got to just invite them and let them do what they do. So in the Saint Cyprian class, first we work on you getting the skills to be able to actually communicate with spirits, which is something that frankly gets skipped over a lot. And then we get into, okay, here's how you invite a spirit. And here's how you compel a spirit. Like, these are not mutually exclusive things. Just like with people, there are some people you want to appeal to their better nature. There are some people you want to develop a deep and long relationship built on mutual trust. And there are other people that you just have to get them to comply no matter what. And then there are some people that your interaction with them is aggressive. You need to win, right? And so the Saint Cyprian course gives the full array, and we throw ourselves whole hog into it. Instead of an evocation out of a grimoire, the evocation that Saint Cyprian kind of had me model was actually one of Mengi's exorcism, the sixth exorcism from the devil's scourge. So it's a lively approach. But it's two-handed. So you have some people that come to this from the Christian angle. You have some people that come to it from the Diabolist angle. And so there's an honor for Lucifer and those powers as well. And a way to conjure based on that authority.
Speaking of that kind of tangentially, we do, Jason, have a question from Glitch Bottle patron Lucid Themes, who's saying, "Hi, Mr. Miller. I love all your content. My question for you is if there's any theurgy possible through the Saint Cyprian course."
Okay, so by theurgy, I'm assuming, and I may be wrong, but I'm assuming that this person is juxtaposing theurgy and thaumaturgy, where thaumaturgy, they're thinking in terms of sorcery, results magic, getting paid, getting laid, that kind of thing. And theurgy, they're thinking of spiritual growth, mysticism, knowing God, etc. So I would say that, like, if you look into the history of those terms, it kind of falls apart. There is a lot of practical results theurgy, and the word thaumaturgy actually comes from, words was applied to saints mostly. But in modern parlance, yes, there's a lot of theurgy. There's a lot of spiritual growth possible and necessary in the course. So that is all in there. I'm not particularly interested in magic that is devoid of spiritual growth or mental growth or enlightenment or mysticism. I prefer the word mysticism because really I find that the effortless methods of mysticism work better than a lot of the esoteric methods, to borrow Richard Smoley's distinction, for spiritual growth. And that really the realization gained through either can still be applied to sorcery.
Christianity, in an esoteric and mystical sense, as you just touched on, is definitely a foundational part of your course. So when it comes to mystical Christianity and the elements of Christianity, what are some of the things that you think people might overlook when they consider Christianity's power in that sense?
It is a religion that got huge. And so the first thing is you look around and you see all these evangelicals and, generally speaking, the Christians that you don't want to associate with, right? But you have to realize that they're a small, loud group. So let's say it's 10%. But when you consider the billions and billions of Christians that there are, in America, roughly 76% of the people around you are nominally Christian in some way. Depending upon your area, that obviously fluctuates. But to hold the idea that it's just all evil is wrong. And so even within what would be considered non-mystical Christianity, you've got Nadia Bowles-Weber, you've got Richard Rohr, you've got former pagan author Carl McColman writing about mystical Christianity. So there is an enormous resource there. There's an enormous amount of influence. The Psalms used for magic, witches in Italy. It's largely a Catholic thing, If you look at the book Mary's Who Maim, I think is the name of it, which is just a study of Catholic folk traditions. It's magic. So it's all there. It's always been there. It's just in Protestant world, it gets overshadowed. Like anything else that gets this big, there are problems, there are problems, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Would any brand of paganism fare as well if the numbers were that high? And it was able to be used as a tool for those who need tools to control people. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I look around and somebody's like, you can be Asatru or something and say, well, you don't find Asatru people as political pawns like this. I mean, obviously you do, because that was a bad example because they're all over the white supremacist networks, but Wicca or something. And it's because it's not statistically relevant in the way that Islam and Christianity are. They're too big. So I guess just don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and don't remove it. When it comes to Saint Cyprian, a lot of people during the Cyprian Renaissance that I was mentioning, they were hot to just jettison any mention of Christ or Christianity, or as a bishop, they were hot to make Justina like a secret pagan or something. And I just said, that's the most bland and boring thing you could do. You've just got another Merlin then. It's boring as all hell. You've already got Merlin. You don't need another Merlin. It is the very fact that he straddles these worlds that makes Saint Cyprian so compelling. So engage, open up your grimoires, and you're going to find rituals that are really based in a big way on Catholic exorcisms.
To your point, Jason, especially in this age of wanting to infernalize things or make things dark or edgy, and people are looking for something that I guess the kids nowadays call something metal, like this is so metal, this is amazing. But when you think about things that are metal, quote unquote, when you consider, even from a mystical level, you don't have to be a devout Christian, but just from a mystical level, when you consider, I mean, what is more metal than a willing crucifixion and going through something like that in a redemptive role? I mean, there's a lot of metal, quote unquote, in those Christian elements that you're talking about.
Well, now we're sounding like Stryper fans from the 80s, like that. Remember the Christian metal band? Like, the hell with the devil!
Right.
So, I don't know if it's metal, but it's deep. There's a lot there. And there is an approach to even the devil and diabolism that is not anti-Christian necessarily. This approach too. So without revealing too much, there is a follow-up to the Saint Cyprian course called Spirits and Spells. And the very last lesson is actually a black liturgy. It's a Luciferian mass, if you will. But in that text, it specifically says, like, if you can't do this and then do this on a Saturday night and then go to a Christian mass on a Sunday morning, you do not have the understanding to be able to do this correctly. Saint Cyprian is standing between these two worlds, saying each one of them has their role, each one of them has their place. And so that's sort of the Cyprianic view of it. I don't know if that's metal or not, but the people that come from, I want dark, I want badass, they always wind up unhappy with me because I'm always like, yeah, you don't want to do that. Like, some people come and they're like, but what about blood sacrifices? And I'm like, look, I've been to animal sacrifices. There's nothing blasphemous about it. These are mostly people who killed the chicken yesterday for dinner. So it's not this dark, evil thing to them. It's part of normal life, And you see this too with some people in America from the occult scene that practice Santa Muerte. And they're like, yeah, it's strong, it's powerful, it's dark. But then if you look at a lot of the altars, not all of them, but if you look at a lot of the altars in Mexico, like they're run by little families, little old ladies, chapels that are sunny and brightly colored. And, they're not dark, evil abysses. So that's never been my bag.
That is such a great way to characterize that. And really, that was one of the big themes I got out of your course, Jason, is the balancing of the polarities, this kind of mingling of light and darkness, and Cyprian kind of between those two worlds. And I think this kind of begs a question from Glitch Bottle patron Sasha Olivier Dulac, who is asking, hi, thank you for the amazing work that you both do. I'd like to ask you, Jason, are there any specific ways to introduce yourself to Saint Cyprian?
You know, what I would recommend is go out, print a picture, or buy a statue. I have oodles of Cyprian statues here now, but there's one that you can find pretty cheaply on Amazon with the purple robe, and you can get that. Or you could just print out a picture, a nice candle, and a glass of water, and sit down, light some incense, and recite the Sorcerer's Call to Saint Cyprian. And then if you want to buff that out with other prayers, you can add in Lord's Prayer. Anima Christi is a wonderful prayer that works well with that. So you can add in these other psalms, other prayers. You can get a book. If you have an intention, some kind of spell you want Cyprian's help with, you can add his Sorcerer's Call and then look up a psalm that would be appropriate for manifesting that. Throw that in and just keep at it. We're coming up on September. September is when the Feast of Saint Cyprian is, so it's a very auspicious time to start. There's a special time, which I should have realized at first, but it was actually Jesse Hathaway that clued me and I guess the rest of the world into the days of the Cyprians, that there's exactly 9 days between the Feast of Saint Cyprian of Carthage and the Feast of Saint Cyprian of Antioch. And so it's tradition to start your Antioch prayers the day after the Feast of Saint Cyprian of Carthage. So you can do a full novena, but you don't have to wait. Just sit down, set a little altar, recite the prayer. If you don't have room for an altar, close your eyes, recite the prayer, add a little intention in there. You'll get it. You'll see.
Can you share with us what are some of the pitfalls that people should avoid while first beginning to work with Saint Cyprian? What are the things that maybe they should steer clear of, or things that maybe they should make sure that they have in order mentally, physically, spiritually before approaching and working with Cyprian?
What a good question. There's not a ton that I think that you have to avoid, except thinking that you know the deal going in. That is, I think, the thing that kills you going in. If you go in and you think this is a Christian saint, nothing more to it, then you might find yourself shocked and dismayed, especially in the Black School course, where by lesson 3, you're doing devil positive rituals. But if you go in thinking like this is blasphemous, I can't utter the word Jesus without it like just feeling sick in my stomach, which, by the way, I understand. Like, there's a lot of trauma out there because, again, Christianity is such a large religion and it's a convenient tool for people to do evil shit. So if people have like this trauma, no one should make you deal with it, right? If people come to the Cyprian course and then after like a couple weeks, they're like, I just can't do it. Like, you're asking me to visualize the cross bleeding into my skull and to view Jesus in a positive way, and I cannot do it. I'm like, I get it. I understand. No problem. No problem. So, be open. You have to kind of be open. There's two things. There's like two competing places where people come to it from. We've got, of course, the Diabolists and the Holy Rollers, but there's also the people that come to it from arts and crafts land and headspace land, right? Headspace land, they want everything to be visualized. They want to pray. They want to see. They want to do everything in their head. They want to think about their intent, but they don't want to say it out loud. They don't want to burn candles. They don't want to make stuff. Similarly, the people in arts and crafts land, they don't want to do energy. They don't want to hear about any kind of body energy or breath exercises or stuff like that. They want to anoint the candle, burn the candles, burn more candles, make more offerings. Like they want to fiddle with the stuff in front of them and pray. Both of those things are good, but you have to integrate them together, at least the way I do magic. So you kind of have to meet in the middle there. The other thing, and probably one of the biggest things, is there's also a crossroads or a crosswalk where you've got some people that are head blind. They don't see things easily. And you've got other people that are just phantasmagoric machines. They close their eyes and they are off on a psychic journey. Like all that they did was like Calgon, take me away. Remember the old commercials? Saint Cyprian, take me away. And they close their eyes. And then I saw Saint Cyprian, Jason, and he had a crown on his head. And he put his bishop mitre on my head and he wore the crown. And then he gave me his scepter and I flew off and I fought the devil and like all this crazy shit. Sorry, am I allowed to curse on the show? I don't know.
Absolutely.
So both of these are fine. But what happens is the people that are prone to visions make the people who are not prone to visions discouraged. And so what I want to say is that you both have work to do. And that the vision-prone people actually have a harder job ahead of them. If you're not prone to visions, that's okay. Because you don't need to have visions in order to do magic. And when you do have visions, when you do conjure that spirit and you make contact in whatever way you can manage, it's going to be a lot of signal and not a lot of noise. You're going to get a lot of actionable information, stuff you didn't know, right? Whereas the people like me who are prone to visions, our job is actually discernment. Our job is cutting through the projection and deepening our experiences, because that's the thing that's lacking. The people having visions and getting caught, like this God showed up and this God showed up and next week another God showed up. That's not lacking in the occult world. What's lacking is that vision yielding anything useful to anyone. And that's the kind of thing where you have to sit down and you say, okay, well, that happened, but it was probably mostly my imagination. And even if it wasn't, there's nothing useful there. There's nothing actionable. So I don't have to worry about where it came from because it doesn't really have any point. And you know, that's how I roll in all my classes. I always give this speech. So I would say that's the big thing. You kind of got to just meet the course in the middle from wherever you are.
And when it comes to that really important point, Jason, about the usefulness of something, I found the cross and skull meditation very powerful. Can you just give us just the broad strokes and that usefulness, to quote you, about the cross and skull meditation? What is being achieved here?
The cross and skull meditation is in lesson 1 of the Black School. We have a very specific method, but in general, if you have looked at, say, an Orthodox cross, or for that matter, seen a documentary about the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem, you know that there is a legend that Golgotha is built over the tomb of Adam, the first human being. And so the story is that man is purified because the blood of Christ drips down onto the skull of Adam, and thus everyone descended from Adam, right? So all of mankind. And so we do an exercise where we visualize the crucifixion above our heads, as if our skull is the skull of Adam. And then there's a purification exercise, and there is even a point in the head that you learn to focus on. this kind of thing, some people, especially if they're coming at it from Solomonic land, they come here and they're like, oh, I don't like these new age exercises with visualizations. And I don't like all this Eastern stuff and body energy. That's all 20th century garbage, right? And so I remember once a Solomonic magician came to, actually a couple times, came to me when I was still doing consults. And I said, sure, hey, why don't you try this? Do this inner heat exercise. And it starts by like visualizing a tetrahedron in the body. And they're like, whoa, no. I don't do any kind of new age stuff. And I'm like, yeah, this exercise is, Naguma lived in 600. So it's like 600 years old. So it's old, being the point, 11th century. And it's sort of just like, oh, really? And they're like, oh, but it's Eastern. It's not our Western thing. And I'm like, come on. Where is the dividing line? Especially when we're talking about practices that originated in the Mediterranean. It's all right there. India is like a hop, skip, and a jump. Afghanistan, which is like the root of Tantra, is like right there. Turkey's right there. Manichaeans, who are Western enough that St. Augustine was a Manichaean before he was a Christian, spread as far as China. And Alexander was going to establish a Hellenic Buddhism in the empire. So this East-West divide doesn't wash with me. So I use a lot of energetic stuff related to the body, to the subtle body, because the subtle body is real, bottom line, and it doesn't belong to any one culture. And if you want to see spirits, sure, you can sit there for 3 hours and repeat the invocation over and over and over again and hope that that does it. But chances are for 2.5 of those hours, the spirit is there going, like banging on the glass of the scrying mirror, like, can't you fucking see me? I'm right here. Like, if you would just move your mind a little bit, you could see me. And it's like, you know, the magician is like, nope, I got to repeat the conjuration again. I rely upon methods that actually help see spirits.
In terms of, Jason, this theme of usefulness and kind of getting to the core of things, and especially the different facets of the Cyprianic tradition, we have a question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Delaney Marie. And Delaney is asking, I've heard references before to a type of ritual where one baptizes, quote unquote, a troublesome spirit through Saint Cyprian's mediation, and that spirit becomes peaceful or even an ally. Is this a thing, Delaney is asking? And if it is, where can I learn more about it?
It is a thing, and we teach a version of it in the Black School course, so you can learn about it there. But it is not just a thing with me. I worked with it and developed something a little different than what I received because the spirits told me to. But I have never seen it in a book. I have only been given it by people that have worked with curanderos or brujos in Mexico. So I guess a little more research into brujeria. But even there, it's not very common. I believe that it is influenced by Kardakian spiritualism, where they have this idea in Allan Kardec's spiritualism of elevating spirits. And, you know, that Kardakian spiritualism is a very heavy influence from Brazil on up. So I believe that the baptism of the devil, which is what it's usually called, it started off as a way to baptize the dead, a la, you know, the Mormons and so on. It would help you conjure the dead and extend heaven's grace to them. Somewhere along the line, some ingenious sorcerer said, you know, rather than links to, you know, my Uncle Frank, I'm going to put the seal of Asmodeus in here and see what happens. And so what happens is that you are linking this spirit to heaven. You are forming this bridge. And in fact, it's much more than just a baptism. When you learn it, you see that it's actually several sacraments all at once. It's like a lifetime of sacraments extended over a few days. It's a very powerful ritual. I can't speak to any kind of like it then makes them Christian. What I can say is that they behave differently for you. They behave differently for you. They lack none of their passion, none of their vitality, none of their individualism. And if you want to know what I think the big difference between angels and demons is, it's individualism versus collectivism. That's the biggest single denominator if you want to make a separation. So it doesn't take anything away from them, but it makes them much more amenable, much more willing to give you what you intend rather than what you asked for in word only. So it's good for helping avoid the ham sandwich problem. And then it makes them easier to contact in the future.
I think Delaney's question and your response about linking a spirit to heaven flows well into the prayer of the 3 nails that you teach, where the practitioner effectively unites heaven and earth in a powerful way. Can you, Jason, maybe share just some of the broad strokes about the prayer of the 3 nails and how it can be used to consecrate intent and perhaps rid oneself of unwanted influences?
So this is, again, an element from the course, I think the second lesson in the course. And the 3 nails are, it could be considered a heresy. The idea that Christ was crucified with 3, not 4 nails is like a weird heresy. But it is a tradition strongly linked to Saint Cyprian. And there is a hand gesture that links to the 3 nails. And there are other elements of 3. So, for instance, the 3 nails of Christ, the 3 cock crows, the 3 times that Peter is denied, the 3 times that Cyprian attempted to woo Justina with demons. There's a mystical link between these 3 things. And in the course, there are a number of elements where we work with the Christian idea that, look, if God can be made manifest, what makes God manifest, can hold God to earth, is certainly more than enough to hold spirits to earth, is certainly more than enough to hold your intention to manifestation. So you can write a petition and then you use especially consecrated nails to nail it to a tree or use the gesture in a particular way. So there's all manner of sorcery that can be done with it. But it does work on this basis. It works on this basis of the crucifixion. And so sometimes people are like, but I'm not a passionate Christian. I don't know if I believe that Christ was really God manifest. And to that I say, yeah, I don't either. Even if you were not just to go into a church, but if you were to go into a conclave of priests and bishops and got them to all answer anonymously, you'd find that many of them have doubts. But the belief factor, like, it's so not very important in magic. Like, what you believe about something is one of the least important things in magic and honestly in religion too. We have this very kind of Western modern idea of what our personal beliefs are really matters. And they so don't. I always illustrate this for people. I'm like, how many times in the Bible did Jesus question the beliefs of the people around him? Like, he's like, if you're going to sit down with me, I got to know, what do you believe? Not a single time. Not once does he give 2 shits about what people believe. And that to me is right at the root of any kind of beneficial interpretation of the Christian mystery.
Again, coming back to that theme of the usefulness, the understanding, the kind of bathing in this tributary, especially someone as fascinating and multifaceted as Saint Cyprian. And I think that this leads to Saint Cyprian's book. And you say that this is, quote, the most iconic aspect of Cyprianic lore, unquote. And obviously, many listeners are familiar with the Book of Spirits, the Liber Spiritum, and kind of the grimoire side of things. So can you share, Jason, what is this book in Cyprianic lore? And then how do you have students engage with this book?
The legend of Cyprian's book or books that he had his magic in. It's such a tantalizing idea, right? The greatest magician of the age. And so there are all kinds of stories. So for instance, the famous Witch of Evora from Portugal, she is said to have gotten her powers because she grabbed Cyprian's books after he threw them out the window and became a bishop. That's one story. There's another story where she taught Cyprian magic, and there are other stories still. But the Book of Saint Cyprian is itself it's like a grail. It's a thing of legend. And Jose Leto did a wonderful job of collecting all these legends about the Book of Saint Cyprian and, you know, the ways in which it's guarded, in which people who find it are tested. I can't remember the name of the book now, and I don't want to get up to look on my bookshelf, but if you look for it, it might be the Immaterial Book of Saint Cyprian. So it's a collection of Portuguese legends just about the book, not a translation of the book, just legends about people finding the book, because that's how iconic it was. And then you have all these different Cyprianus books, right? You have the Black Books of Elverum in Norway. They're attributed to Saint Cyprian. You have various Svartskonböcker, the Swedish black books. Many of them are attributed to Saint Cyprian as if he wrote them. And then throughout Spain, Portugal, Brazil, Central America, you have just oodles, dozens of books that are translations of. Some of them are other grimoires, right? Like, so it's like the Red Dragon and some other more even modern occult knowledge with a cool Cyprian story in the front and the back, kind of like the Necronomicon, right? Like, we're going to take a bunch of Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian texts. We're going to throw some badass looking stuff on top of it. We're going to throw a story about the Mad Arab in the front and back, and voila, we have a Necronomicon. So, I mean, some of it is just like that, but there's a tradition there. There's a depth there. And in the Black School, we have a very specific way to work with the book as tool and as altar. So there's a very specific way to start your book. And then what happens after it's started, it will depend upon your work with the spirits. So in the future, 200 years from now, if someone comes across someone's Black School book, they'll say, oh, this was from the Black School of Saint Cyprian. We can tell because of this particular pattern in it. And we can now compare this to others because it's got different spirits and different notes and things like that.
One of the kind of overall themes that I really enjoyed about your course, and really also the different tributaries, traditions, and facets that you approach things with, is the complex nature of Cyprian and how Cyprian touches and kind of has fingerprints on many other traditions. So, for example, in the quote unquote grimoire tradition, we hear a lot about the four kings, Orion, Zamaimon, Paimon, and Aegon, and also the four archangels. Can you share about the importance and role that you emphasize in the Black School about the four kings and the four archangels?
Yeah. So the Black School we work with the four kings. They're like the four pillars that support the work, once we leave working with Saint Cyprian and God and sort of Melchizedek and other figures that we work with to establish our spirit skills and things like this, we immediately have to start working with these four kings because they manage the conflux of heaven and hell in the four directions. And in fact, another book not attributed to Saint Cyprian, but the Clavis Inferni, which has invocations of Saint Cyprian, and probably the most famous images of the four kings in both regal and animal form and their seals and so on. They are gatekeepers. They open the ways. And if you want to traffic with both heaven and hell, the four kings are indispensable.
In regards to that very point, Jason, you focus in the course about the power of exorcism. Can you maybe share a little bit about exorcism in general? And then also, I know so many people, I know myself when I was first starting out, want to just jump right in and, let's conjure demons. But you say, hold on, wait a minute. Before even proceeding there's an exorcism of the four elements needed before any exorcism of a spirit is made. Can you just share about all of that?
Well, I don't know if I would say that it's before any evocation of spirits is needed, but in this case, it is the model that this exorcism evocation goes after. So the first thing is, there are people out there, in fact, I've seen it written in books, that exorcism is the opposite of evocation, that evocation is the opposite of exorcism. That in exorcism, you're banishing a spirit, and in evocation, you are calling a spirit. But that is just simply not true. It's not true at all. Exorcism, or kizo, means to bind by oath. An exorcism and a compelling evocation are more or less the same operation. You are getting a spirit and saying, you now need to do what I say, because either A, I'm calling upon the powers of heaven and they can kick your ass, or I'm calling upon the powers of that rule hell. According to the org chart, they're above you. So you have this sort of, it can work either way. But what you do once they are bound by oath, that's kind of what the only difference is. But the actual ritual is the same. So if the demon is in a person or in a house or something, and you adjure it by oath, and then you say, okay, fuck off out of here, well, then that's a exorcism. But if you then say, appear here at the edge of this circle so that I can talk to you, or in this crystal so that I can talk with you and ask you questions clearly, and you don't mess with me because you're under this power, and you have to appear the way I want you to because you're under power, well, it's still the same thing. You're just having it do something different. What we do is we have in the Black School these lighter-handed methods, these methods of invitation. You couldn't tell sometimes if you walk into a temple and you see a circle on the floor and an altar and a crystal, you might not be able to tell whether it's an evocation through force or invitation. You would have to listen to it. But if we're going to do force, then by golly, we're going to do force. So we follow the great exorcist Mengi. We follow his pattern where you are invoking the power of God, and then you're going through all the elements to say, don't let this demon rest in the air. Don't let him rest in the fire. Don't let him rest in the rock. And then eventually down to hell, compelling the lords of hell. Like, he can't rest in hell either. He's got to come here. Got to appear before me. That's how we exercise all those elements so that there is nowhere for that spirit to go but in front of us.
When it comes to necromancy, can you share with the listeners what is the role and the lore of Saint Cyprian regarding necromancy?
Well, similar to demons, Saint Cyprian is able to conjure the dead and to get them to speak. It is, specifically in his lore. He learned the mysteries of the witch's craft at Tauropolis, and he went specifically to Sparta to learn necromancy. Why Sparta to learn necromancy? Because the graves of people who died violent deaths are easy to conjure, right? So that's why in Greece, the Aori are so easy to conjure, because they're the spirits of beings that met a violent end or an early death. And so Saint Cyprian went to Sparta to learn necromancy. And by his power, we can call up these beings. And the powers of Saint Cyprian, they're not just magical, they are linked to the sacraments because he's a bishop. So think about the powers of the priest. When you die and you call a priest for a funeral, it's kind of similar to what I just said about exorcism and evocation. It's the same thing, you're just doing something different. So with a funeral, you've got the soul of this person and you're commending it to heaven. Well, what happens if you get the soul of the person, but you don't commend it to heaven? Can you call it from heaven or wherever it happens to be? And the answer is yes. So the powers of sorcery, they lie in the sacraments. Just have to be clever about it.
You mentioned, Jason, in your course that when you respectfully, of course, take dirt from the grave of a spirit you wish to engage with, you should pay that spirit for the dirt. And you say, quote, appropriate payment can include coins or whiskey. Mercury dimes are traditional, but not necessary, unquote. Can you share a little bit about just why coins, whiskey, and mercury dimes? I think people would really find that fascinating.
Well, the mercury dime, that's something that I was taught by my first root work mentor. He owned a shop and I bought things from the shop, and he talked a lot. So I learned a lot. I never want to mischaracterize a relationship. So I mention that only because I don't want to give people the impression like, and then the days and hours that I spent at this person's home walking through the graves and learning everything they knew. It's not like that. But, he always taught me a mercury dime is a powerful dime. It had the god, the psychopomp, the god that can descend anywhere he wants and travel anywhere he wants, right there on the dime. So a perfect fitting coin when you want to communicate with the dead, an offering to communicate with the dead, or at least gain their influence. Coins, of course, traditional for the dead ever since the age of Charon, paying for the river Styx. Whiskey is just a nice offering to spirits in general. So it just always seems to work out well, especially hot spirits. And very often people are going to the graveyard to employ hot spirits. Not all the time, not always, but often, people are there for reasons that involve justice or curse work or something like that, but not all the time. I go to different writers' graves all the time just to receive their blessing. So like that, I wouldn't pour whiskey unless they liked whiskey, which a lot of writers do. So I would pour whiskey. Saint Cyprian can walk like Mercury. He can call down the angels from heaven. He can call up the demons from hell, and he can call present the spirits of the dead.
Jason, this flows so well into the next question, which is, you mentioned that, quote, necromancy is complicated because a spirit can be in any number of abodes. So can you maybe share some practical tips and things that people should keep in mind in general when they are conducting a necromantic rite?
Yeah. So not only can the spirit be in a number of abodes, but is very likely in multiple abodes. So the idea that there's just a body and then a spirit, and then like when that spirit leaves, it's just like who it was alive, is almost, for me, to my thinking, it's borderline silly. When I think about how different this interview would be if I drank some chamomile tea this afternoon versus a cappuccino, and therefore I think how much my thoughts depend upon external phenomena and chemicals in my brain. The idea that like someone could suffer brain death and just be exactly the same as they were when they were alive is just sort of like, it boggles the mind. So when a person dies, there is a part that moves on. There is a part that can stay. Sometimes the part that moves on doesn't move on, and it gets trapped in the part that can stay. And then there's a part that dissolves over time. So there are all these sheaths and layers. And so you can go to any grave and get a response, but you'll go to some graves and you'll get a very strong response because there's more attachment there. There's more of what made that person human remaining around than not. Then there's also elevated dead. There's, people that have been exalted, that have had legends, true or not, laid upon them. And that seems to feed into these spirits, making them great, making them powerful. This is how we get the powerful Loa and Orisha and so on. They're the dead who become elevated. It's a complicated thing, but yet it's not that complicated. It's complicated if you expect the same thing every time. The process itself is not all that different than conjuring any other spirit. And it can be done in a number of ways as well. You can do an invitation, like laying out offerings that person enjoyed in life and asking them to join you, such as with a dumb supper. Or it can be an invitation where you set everything up like an evocation, but you ask that spirit to show up, and you call upon Saint Cyprian or other intercessionary spirits, or even personal familiars. And you say, hey, go invite this spirit to attend. And maybe you get something and maybe you don't. And maybe you get something strong and maybe you get a distant echo. And then there are compelling and very forceful methods. So when going into it, you want to know that you have the ability to protect yourself. And I don't just mean the ability to cast a circle for the ritual and to shout out conjurations. I mean the ability to recognize psychic attack or spiritual attack and to dispel it should it happen. If you can't do that, I would recommend staying away from necromancy.
Do you think that's one of the biggest things, Jason, that if someone's hearing this right now, or if they're planning a necromantic rite in the coming days, that might be one of the things that you might hear from people most often about, oh, I was focused on this necromantic rite, but I didn't think about the potential for an attack, or I didn't think about all of the defensive things, quote unquote, that come into play?
Well, strangely, I hear the opposite too much. I guess, I want people to be safe. I want people to protect themselves, but I actually don't want people to be weighed down with protection. I want people to be able to handle themselves and be confident that if something goes wrong, that they can handle it. Because what I see are people that go out and then so they set up walls, and circles aren't walls, by the way. So I'm not talking about circles, but they will set up walls. They want to banish. They want to make sure that nothing can get in and out. They are wearing protection upon protection upon protection. because they're just like, I'm going to go to the graveyard and talk to the spirits. I've got to make sure I'm protected. And what happens is you're so protected that they can't make contact with anything. It actually hampers their ability to function as a magician, as a medium. They can't open, and you can't open yourself and close yourself at the same time. It's very difficult, which is why so many magicians have worked with seers, right? But that can also be less than ideal for certain reasons. So what I suggest is that people learn that not every spirit is just out to get you. In fact, most aren't, including at the graveyard. So you don't necessarily need massive amounts of protection just to talk to a spirit in the boneyard or to conjure the spirit of the dead. But at the same time, if something were to go wrong, you want to be able to do something about it. I guess what I'm saying is it's the difference in, like, I'm going to have a party, but I need to run full background checks on everyone that attends, and I need to make sure only the right people attend and not these other people. And I need to make sure that I have a panic room ready and available, and that I'm wearing a Kevlar vest and, like all this crazy stuff, in which case nobody's going to come to the party because you're nuts. Versus having a party and, like, I'm going to have this party and I'm going to invite people. I will have some friends there that if it gets rowdy, I can throw people out. And I'm also going to have the number of the police handy so that if something happens, I know who to call. Like, then you have a nice party. And most of the time, nothing bad happens. So if anything, I would say it's the opposite problem. Right now, the occult world is having this bout of superstition and fear, like nothing I've ever seen in the last few years. Like, people are scared to do anything.
Where do you think that comes from, Jason? Does that come from an oversaturation of available materials? Does it come from people on forums who are posting unverified personal gnosis and putting people off? Does it come from people's own obsessions about, I need to have everything be perfect and I want all of the protection in the universe? Where do you think that comes from?
It comes from a number of different places. It comes from the experts who aren't experts. Like, just make sure you're safe. Just make sure you're protected, right? And there's more to it than that. I mean, my first book was about protection and reversal magic. So maybe I'm as much to blame as anybody else. Because at the time, I saw people not taking curses and spiritual attacks seriously. But this is, 15 years ago that I wrote that. And now it's like the opposite. Like, people burn a candle and, oh my God, the wax looks kind of like a dog and I'm going to die. Or, who is out to get me? And then they go out onto TikTok and they get readings from like 9 people. And each of the 9 people tell them somebody different is cursing them. And then instead of thinking, 8 or possibly even 9 of these people don't know what they're talking about, they think, why are 9 people cursing me? Oh my God. Right. And there's also just, there's an enjoyment of drama. There are people who get into magic because they want to make life more interesting, and that's one way to do it. I don't want to overstate the dangers, and I don't want to understate the dangers. There are dangers, but I often feel people overstate them. I feel even sometimes traditions can overstate them. Certainly, I don't feel like demons warrant the kind of, I've got a new book coming out called Consorting with Spirits. It'll be out next spring. And the cover that Weiser chose has Malphas on the cover. And so I'm like, cool. I like Malphas. Malphas is cool. And then somebody I was talking to is like, yeah, but according to the book, even if you give Malphas offerings, he'll still screw you over. And I'm like, yeah, well, you can't believe everything that's written in the book. Like Malthus seemed okay to me. He's good in my book. Just people in general need to stay away from the extremes of thinking. Like you don't want to be unprotected in magic. You want to know what to do when something happens. But at the same time, you don't want to suffer from what I call the Excalibur problem. The Excalibur problem is not named after the sword, but named after the movie. You remember the movie from the 80s, Excalibur?
Oh, I do. It's been a while since I've seen it, but...
Right. So 1981, one of Liam Neeson's first films, although he had, a bit part. Helen Mirren was Morgan Le Fay. So it was really cool. However, they wore like this ridiculously heavy armor throughout the whole film. I mean, they eat in it. They screw in it. They do everything in like just jousting armor. It's insane. And so if you were to walk around in this armor all the time, you couldn't get anything done. And magical protection can be like this. If you wake up and you need to spend an hour banishing the living hell out of everything in your life, you can't then sit down and be like, why don't the spirits talk to me? It doesn't work that way.
That is such a fantastic analogy. I know myself, I hope the listeners really carry that forward about the Excalibur problem, one of the things to definitely avoid. And Jason, when it comes to these topics, and you brought up so many great points, but to follow your last one about approaching things with sincerity by looking at a tradition, but approaching it in your own idiosyncratic way. Let's talk about skulls and the proper way to work with skulls. You guide students through a ritual for gaining a long-term familiar spirit, which I know many listeners are familiar with or might engage with. But can you share about how long-term familiars interact with and their role in the Cyprianic work? And then also a little bit about why a human skull is the best vessel for a long-term familiar spirit.
I mean, I don't know if it is the best vessel in general. So there's a lesson in the Cyprian course where I teach a really complex way of getting a spirit to inhabit a human skull, not necessarily the spirit of the being that was in the skull. And this idea is something, I mean, it exists all over the world. The Tachikawa in Japan do it, or did it. I don't think there are any Tachikawa anymore. It's pretty obvious. This was the head. This was the seat. Was the vessel that held a spirit while it was alive. So it can hold another spirit. It is the thing that communicated. So it is just a fitting vessel for communication. But it's one of those things that you want to make sure it's ethically sourced. You want to make sure that you're not grave robbing a skull. And of course, an ethically sourced human skull, you're talking about, if you buy it, it's an investment of hundreds, if not over $1,000. So it's a big deal. So failing that, then I would recommend getting a skull replica, preferably not the one with the planetary seals on it, with the Expus seal on the head and the Mercury seal on the forehead, just because I'm so goddamn sick of seeing it everywhere on everyone's Instagram. So
right.
I'm calling a moratorium on that skull. But no, you can actually get like a nice replica skull for medical school for fairly cheap that you can then consecrate. You can rub with oil, carve away and use as you will, and then see if a spirit can inhabit that. I've seen people do it with crystal bottles of the Crystal Skull vodka even. I am actually at the point now where I want to take the lesson out of the course because it's so complicated and not a lot of people do it. And then there are people who do it where there are commitments that you kind of have to keep because now you've summoned the spirit into this thing and you've got to keep up after it, and then people don't. And then that's how you get into a little trouble. So high maintenance magic. And you want to make sure that you actually have the time and interest in keeping this thing up. That's all I'll say about that.
Can you share about that very important concept in general? Meaning, when people say, oh, why I had a successful operation or I'm working with the spirit and all of a sudden I feel like nothing's happening. I feel like the relationship has somehow been truncated or severed. Can you just talk about if you do have mutually agreed upon terms with the spirit, regardless of the operation, and you don't keep up your end of the bargain, quote unquote, can you just talk about how being lax in that area has real consequences?
Yeah, it has the same consequences with human people. You lose trust. You can't be relied upon to keep your word. So they're not compelled to keep their word. This is especially true if you want to compel spirits, right? You can't boss spirits around and not keep your word. If your word doesn't mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything when it's uttering the name of God either. That said, understandable lapses happen. So you also don't want to get involved with spirits that are completely petty, that are known. And there are spirits that are known for exacting terrible vengeance upon people that make missteps. There are those spirits out there. And unfortunately, people get attracted to them because it feels like something powerful and badass until it actually happens to you. And then it feels like something horrific and you're trapped in a horror movie. Don't do it. Be real about your needs, your time, your ability. Be frank. Just because a spirit wants something doesn't mean you have to give it. And the relationship works both ways. I know so many people, they make a deal with the spirit and the spirit doesn't do anything. And then they give the offering they promised out of fear. Like, well, if I didn't give it, then what would happen? Like, well, it didn't give you what you wanted. So probably nothing would happen because you either didn't have the spirit in the first place or it's not able to do much. And at any rate, it didn't do the job you asked for, so don't pay it. If you think it tried, if you show signs, then maybe you can give part of something. But, relationships work two ways. There are too many people out there that the spirit wants something, so I'm going to do it. I mean, we just had that guy murdered a bunch of people in England, murdered someone with the intent of murdering more people because of some pact with a demon. Like, that's crazy.
Very wise words from an experienced magician. And Jason, to that point, could you give us the broad strokes of the Cyprianic calls of Metatron? What is the relationship between Cyprian and, in many traditions, Metatron, this highest of all super celestial beings?
Well, this is yet another thing that I sometimes wonder if people think like, oh, Jason thought this up, or Jason, maybe it's UPG or something. But it actually just kept coming up in research. So I was collecting all these novenas from Mexico and Central America, and an inordinate amount of them mentioned Metatron. They're novenas to Saint Cyprian or to Saint Cyprian and Saint Justina, and in one case to Saint Cyprian, Saint Justina, and Saint Theoctistus, who is the saint that converted to Christianity upon seeing their martyrdom. It mentions Metatron. And I was always like, why Metatron? Like, it seemed just like a I don't know, a disconnect from that Iberian sorcery. And so what Cyprian said is that Metatron is a human-made angel, made king of the angels, the highest and most powerful angel, closest to God himself, was at one point a human being. So establishes that link of holy sorcerers, right? That link of from Enoch on, Enoch being the human that was glorified into becoming Metatron, according to tradition. It is based upon that we have the ability to earth the angels. So if a human can ascend to heaven, then the angels can descend to earth and be made to perform earthly tasks. That's the broad stroke. And so Metatron and Cyprian are in a lineage of beings that can do that. There are others that we mention in the conjurations.
I love that concept between Metatron and Cyprian and earthing angels. That's just such a fantastic way to approach specific engagements that you share about in the course. And one of the things, Jason, that you touch on as well, and we've discussed this in previous episodes too, is the importance of offerings and the right way or some pathways to offering things to spirits. And we do have to that point a question from Glitch Bottle patron Delaney Marie. And Delaney is asking, my question is, how do you go about offering a form of exercise to a spirit ally? In the past, I've seen magicians offer doing something they're afraid about. I usually offer poems, art, or general offerings of food, drink, and fumigation. However, Delaney says, recently, as I have been progressing with dance and weight training, it just had me curious. What deities, Jason, or spirits, saints, or angels usually like exercise as an offering? Thank you.
Wow. Good question. So I've never met a spirit that actually likes exercise as an offering, like just dedicating these reps. I'm dedicating these reps to you, Sandalphon. Like, in that sense, no. Dance as an art form, of course, might be appreciated by any deity that is connected with art and dance and movement. So you can say, I'm dancing for you and I'm offering this up to you, and then perform the dance and see what happens. To me, these other offerings are nice and they are good adjuncts to a base offering of sustenance of some kind. But I would not want to see someone go and just start only offering dance in place of candles, incense, wine, food offerings when appropriate, and things like that.
That's a very, very good point about the augmentation of something versus something that's already been established in that tributary. And that leads to another question we have for you from Glitch Bottle patron Lucid Themes, who's saying, hello, Mr. Miller. I was wondering how a developed relationship with Saint Cyprian through your course could potentially augment and improve any already existing practice. Lucid's asking, in what ways have your previous students developed themselves similar to all the testimonials of the Hecate course?
Well, this course, I've probably had more people in the general, like in the magical community, come around and say, this is actually formed like the core of my practice. When I conjure a spirit, I rely upon these methods more. So in that sense, that I guess would be the testimonial from some, if that's what they're looking for. There have been people who, they've improved their lives in various material ways, in various spiritual ways. There are people who have healed their relationships with Christianity. There are people who have healed their relationships with the devil. They're people who have found immense vigor and independence through the left side of the work. And then there are people who have found something reliable and profound on the right side of the work. So, and this left and right side of the work, in the end, it all falls away. It's a dualism that's functional to talk about, but not real in an ultimate sense, I guess is what I want to say.
I think that leads into another listener question we have for you from patron Manuel SC. And Manuel is asking, hey, Jason, for you as someone who works with Hecate and has worked with Hecate for more than 20 years now, what has Saint Cyprian offered and brought for you personally?
Oh, so many things, but the house I live in comes immediately to mind. When my wife decided that she was ready to quit her job, that summer, I was in New Orleans and I bought a statue from Mama Carmel down there from Cuba of Saint Cyprian. So it's a plaster statue, but it had no crozier, right? So I had Marcus make me a iron crozier, but before that, I made a petition to Saint Cyprian. And I said, listen, I want to get my business to the point where I can comfortably move. I want the down payment, like a significant down payment before we even start looking. And I wanted to be guided to the right house to move up to Vermont. And so I rolled up this petition and I put his hand where the crozier should be. And I instructed various spirits as he suggested throughout the next several months. And the down payment fell into place almost miraculously. We came up here to Vermont on a New Year's Day looking at houses. The house we thought we were going to buy, we decided we did not want to buy. And I did in the hotel a working with Saint Cyprian involving both angels and demons. But still a simple working, not like a massive conjuration or something, because I was in the hotel with my family. And the next morning, our realtor called us up and said, I have one more house to show you. And that is now the house that we're living in. So Saint Cyprian is a magnificent intercessor. He connects you with other spirits, living, dead, heaven, hell. He can link them up. He and Justina in particular can teach you some of the best ways to unwind magic that I've ever seen. People with really strong, long ancestral curses and things like that Justina makes short work of. And so this combination between the two, where Saint Cyprian can identify the magic and then passes it off to Justina, who just takes it apart like she's just ripping apart a loose knit sweater or something.
This leads into a question from Glitchwaddle patron Ronald D'Souza, who is asking, hi, Jason, I love your work. I would like to know more about this course in relationship to your Sorcery of Hecate course. Since Hecate is a course focused in meditation, mantras, and some other technologies, how is your approach with Cyprianic magic? Could you give us some parallel between these two courses? And what kind of accomplishment could I do with Cyprianic magic that maybe I cannot do with Hecate?
You know, I'm going to leave the last question open. I can't think of anything that's like, oh, you can do this with this, but not with that. It's sort of like, it's just different tools, different spirits. And a lot of my spirit work is guided not because of, oh, this spirit's going to give me this, but because I love the spirits. I mean, I was drawn to Saint Cyprian because I loved the idea of Saint Cyprian. I loved the idea of the sorcerer saint, of the martyr mage. It spoke to my understanding of Christianity, which is very important to me. It was a way for me to deepen that. And so you can do sorcery with it, and you can do sorcery with Hecate. And both courses there's nothing that's alike about them. The tactics and strategies and approach to magic are different. They're utterly and completely different. The systems are different. I think some people think that, oh, well, Jason did a Hecate course, so now he's going to do a Jupiter course, and it's going to basically be the same thing, just a different mantra or things like that. And I just completed a Jupiter course, and as anyone in it can tell you, it is completely different than either one of these two courses. It takes a different tack at the magic entirely. But in the Saint Cyprian course, there's still meditation. There's still energetic work, and there's still devotional work, and there's conjuration. And all of that is in the Hecate course as well. It's just how it gets done that's different. But I don't want to delve too far into details of two different courses that you kind of have to work them to understand them.
Jason, too, we have a question from Glitch Bottle patron Cabra. And Cabra is asking, does the legend of the Bruja de Evora or Maura Torta play into your lineage at all?
A little bit, yes, it does. So I wouldn't call it a lineage because I have collected information both from texts and from informants, people who are kind enough to share their practices with me. But it was put into a cohesive teaching by me. So it's not really a lineage until I pass it down to people, possibly my kids. Who knows? I'm not ready to pass it down yet. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to quibble over words. But yeah, Bruja Evora absolutely plays a part in part 2 of the Black School, which is called Spirits and Spells. We dig into the Witch of Evora, both traditional spells relating to her and Cyprianic specific spells. Mostly what we use her for is as a tutelary spirit for getting to know the local plants, minerals, herbs, etc., and how they could be used in magic. That's sort of like the big role of Bruja Evora in the class.
Also, Jason, in our conversation today, but also in previous chats, I know that you really take care to emphasize that students understand things and that everything is kind of easily explained and there's an opportunity for questions and things like that. And to that point, we have a question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Justin Walker. And Justin is asking, as someone new, Jason, to the Western occult tradition, I'm still struggling to understand the distinction between the words wizard, mage, and sorcerer. I was told Saint Cyprian was the consummate sorcerer. What about his life demonstrates this?
I used to really dismiss the term wizard. I just used to say, look, Gandalf is a wizard, so let's leave that for the fantasy books. And then recently some spirit work related to Jupiter has me reassessing the role of the wizard. So think of it like this. Think of the sorcerer or the witch as someone who very often, the witch often stands outside of society. The sorcerer very often operates within society and sometimes in a subversive way. The wizard kind of is also outside of society, but passes through it. When you think of Merlin or even John Dee, these were not countercultural characters. They're advisors to the crown. They are invested in what happens, yet also above it. And there's a certain mystery there to be contemplated. So, but that said, these are my distinctions. The words, etymologically, they can be interchangeable somewhat. You really have to look for context because what they mean can mean different things to different people at different times. I like the word sorcerer because it's possible nowadays to be a magician and actually do absolutely no magic. Like you can be a magician who is only interested in talking to angels and traversing spheres and holiness and changes in consciousness, et cetera, to use a Dion Fortune-ism. And it's possible to be a witch and just practice the religion and not do any spells, where you're celebrating Sabbaths and devotion to the gods and things like this. Whereas a sorcerer, a sorcerer is doing spells. A sorcerer is out there messing stuff up with magic. And so however spiritual or unspiritual he may be, it's getting applied in the real world. So that to me is the big difference.
To apply that to Cyprian, talk about being the consummate sorcerer, Cyprian was operating outside of the bounds of contemporary Christianity, as you say, using demons to attract or seduce people. I mean, there is that element there.
Christianity is still a minority religion at this point, so which is why it's able to be persecuted. And so, sure, he was a wizard at that point, sought after, and a consummate sorcerer in that sense. But the reason that people love Saint Cyprian, the reason that we know of Saint Cyprian now, is because of the fusion of Christianity and magic. So he's the consummate sorcerer because he's the master of, Christian sorcery. And for good or for ill, that is the lens that most Western magic gets passed through, one way or another.
Jason, as well, we have a listener question for you from Glitch Bottle patron Stephen Civadelic. And Stephen is asking, hey, Alex and Jason. Jason, hi, big fan mate from here down under. I have a somewhat darker question related to my engagement with Saint Cyprian over the last 2 years. As a background, I practice in a traditional witches' coven in Australia that focuses on Hecate, the Fates, and Night, Goetia, ancient Greek mystery traditions, and Orphic practices within the context of witchcraft from the craft elders, so Gardner Sanders and Cochrane. I'm very keen to take part in your Cyprian course to deepen my magic with this wonderful mage whom I first learned about through my mother, who's Greek Orthodox, and then I heard about him on Rune Soup by Conjureman Ali a year later. Naturally, I've read everything about him and I've dedicated an altar to him upon which I leave regular offerings as well as chanting his prayers and working with him in ritual. Recently, I've asked him to do some powerful binding work on someone who had caused me a significant problem in the past. Things have since then happened which leave no question in my mind that he interceded to hopefully disseminate my opposition. My question is, what has your experience been with compelling Cyprian, and how are some ways I may definitively seek out answers from him as to how and when my opponent will be crushed?
Wow. So I'm gonna have a disappointing answer, unfortunately, which is I don't compel Cyprian. So I don't do works where it's like, I demand you answer. I give rituals to compel spirits, but I don't love them. They're not my go-to. Just like with people, it's not my go-to. It's not how I like to live life. So I use them when I have to, and I live my life so that I rarely have to. So I don't have any way to compel Cyprian. I would use Cyprian as a power to compel if necessary. As to the work with the enemy, etc., there's not enough for me to go on here. So what you want to do is you can do readings. You can ask Cyprian to give the information that you want. But in the end, your spell is going to work or it's not going to work. And within a certain time frame that's meaningful, right? Like if they die of old age, then whether your spell had anything to do with it or not, it wasn't functionally important. So there's that. And then I very rarely comment on curse work at all. So I'm going to skip commenting further. It's one of those things that I have seen people shy away from curse work to the point that it's silly or they pretend it doesn't exist. But then it's like everything else. We swing immediately to the other direction and people engage with it too cavalierly very often. So I very rarely want to talk about it. Having done curse work that I have later regretted because of the heaviness of the fallout and the long-term fallout for something that then seems petty. It's not something I want to discuss, especially not over kind of a podcast kind of thing.
It sounds like your broader message too, Jason, is as powerful as cursing or malignant evocatory procedures or operations can be. There is a ton of power in pursuing and utilizing other options, basically, esoterically. There's a lot on the table there outside of the circumference of curse work.
There is. And so curse work has its place. There are people who lay out all kinds of rules that, there has to be some kind of clear benefit or you have to be stopping someone, but never for revenge, or I don't have any rules like that. So if there are people out there who can never gain any justice through the system for various reasons, so I'm not going to say that their revenge is a terrible reason. What I can say is that there are people who do it often, and then it becomes a lens through which to view the world. It's a bad lens through which to view the world. One of the last consultations I did before I stopped doing them, there were 3 people up for a promotion at their job, a significant, vice president type of thing. And so I'm expecting, okay, so here's how we're going to make you shine. Here's how we're going to influence the hiring manager, like either one or both of those. And instead it was, how do I take out these other 2 people? And it just sort of that's your lens now. You've done so much curse work. That's the lens that you view it through. And people can approach love this way. They do it all the time. Love me or you're cursed, or you will never rest, rather than finding somebody who might actually, in fact, love them. There's a lot of traditional magic that frankly is garbage. It's traditional, but it's not doing anybody any favors. One of the reasons that people sometimes, and not just Christians, magic was outlawed in Rome at various periods in Greece as well. There are all kinds of things where I look at it and I just shake my head and I'm like, that's just not a great way to view through life. But I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the questioner or what they're doing. I don't know the background. So I'm just explaining kind of why I don't want to comment further on it.
Jason, we do have another question for you just about the Black School in general and the next cycle and where people can sign up. Is there any information that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so go to strategicsorcery.net. You'll see a courses tab and you'll see the Black School of Saint Cyprian. Tap on it and you will see classes begin on September 14th. Class will begin on September 14th, which means I'll open it mid-August.
And Jason, too, you've mentioned it a few times about upcoming books that you're working on, but can you please just share with us any teasers or anything else about upcoming projects or works that you'd like to let listeners know about?
It's called Consorting with Spirits, and you want to look for it from Wiser in spring 2022. And it's going to be all about spirits. It's going to be a comprehensive guide to working with spirits. The reason why it's called Consorting with Spirits, 2 reasons. One, it was the title of a crime that you could be charged with in England at one point. And so It's just sort of like a nod to the illicit nature of this. But it's also the idea that spirits are not just beings that you can just say, hey, I'm going to conjure you once, and then it's a one and done. They are also beings that you can develop a relationship with, that you can get to know, that you can work with extensively, that you can consort with. So that's the next book.
Well, we will certainly keep our ear to the ground on that, Jason. Thank you. And just as we wrap up the main podcast, is there anything else that you'd like listeners to know, or anything else they should keep in mind, either about Saint Cyprian or the Black School, or anything in general that you'd like to leave listeners with?
Well, I teach training. So I like to think of it as martial arts training, right? Like that kind of training, something that you can't do from a book. You can't read it and do it. There are skills out there to master that take work and effort, and then things that you learn and then work on that are built upon those other skills. So even if you never take one of my classes, start viewing magic as something, not something that you can read and take for a spin. Start viewing it as something you need to work at and get good at. And it will transform your work and your life.
Practicing magician, author, strategic sorcerer, and creator of the Black School, the Sorcery of Cyprian, Jason Miller. Jason, thank you so much, as always, just for taking the time and sharing your wisdom on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Listeners and patrons, how wonderful was it to hear Jason's reminder throughout the entire chat about balancing the dichotomies and breaking through the perceived dichotomies to swim in that magical gray area where magic can blossom and flourish from the deepest hells to the highest heavens. That was amazing, and I definitely want to thank Jason for sharing his time and wisdom, and a huge thank you to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon. Your questions were, as usual, wonderful, elucidating, and they took the conversation in new and interesting directions, so I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did, and thank you so much again. And if you would like to support the Glitch Bottle podcast with exclusive perks, I mean, if you're brave enough to put up with an unhealthy amount of nerdiness, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, you can also subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding us all to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.